Hey there, this is Derek Murphy of creativity.com. Today I'm going to be making a vampire book cover for a completed series, and I'm going to be using AI art. I recently made a big post about AI art, and I've been playing around with it. And I made a long video about research and how to figure out what kind of cover to make, but I didn't really show the newest art that I have and why it's pretty amazing for authors. I won't go into the whole discussion about AI. I was actually just talking with Joanna Penn of the Creative Pen, and we have a podcast about AI in general, in terms of, is it the end of art for the entire world, which it might be. That's a big discussion. And there are some legal considerations about making a book cover with AI art that I also answer in my longer blog post. But today, this might actually be a sort of relatively short video because I don't have to do a lot of work with the art that I've gotten. So let me start by showing you this. This was 3 or 4 months ago when I first started playing with Midjourney, and these are really bad, examples. I'm showing you this because already in the last 3 months, the quality of the art has gone up an exponential amount to the point where I can almost use them as is in book covers without needing to refine them in Photoshop. But I think in another, month, 2 months, another year, we're going to be at a completely different level. Microsoft just invested with, they invested with DALL-E 2, and they're basically creating a new Canva, which is already the #1 online graphic design tool that allows you to connect stock photos. And the big thing with AI art is that it's going to very quickly replace all of the stock photo sites. So Microsoft is basically saying, the design code tool for Canva, that's not actually very hard to make. It's the access to all of the art that really makes it valuable. So they're partnering with DALL-E 2 because they know people would rather use a platform where they can create cool art and add the text. The limitation for Canva or any online design tools like that is that they aren't made for book cover design. So they're going to be really limited in terms of the fonts that you can use that define the genre, and also how you can blend layers together, which is really important for book covers. So the first thing that I do when designing a cover is look over the competition. I went through not only covers I like, but specifically when I search for vampire books on Amazon, I want to see what's performing really well, what the top bestsellers look like, and then get a feel for the style of that genre. In the last video I made, I actually broke down specific elements of all of these covers, because even though these are all general vampire covers, there's a big difference in terms of whether they are epic fantasy or urban fantasy or contemporary romance. And there's also a little bit of a blend between symbolic covers like these, which tend to skew traditional. The basic thing with symbolic covers is that they look really pretty and people like them, especially on hardcover on bookshelves. They help because they can be harder to get designed well, and they sometimes, to some people, look more professional. So traditional publishers use them to stand out most of the time. However, people covers tend to sell better on Amazon. So indie authors tend to continue using people covers because they perform better than symbolic covers, unless you're a big name author or unless you've got tons of books, so that it doesn't really matter what your covers look like because you can afford the advertising. So my series is a little bit weird because it's not urban fantasy, it's more close to epic fantasy, but it's actually dystopian fantasy or post-apocalyptic survival. So that's a kind of weird cross-blend genre to try to figure out. But I'm ignoring all of that to the most part because the most important thing is to hit the vampire romance. People who are buying my book, the selling point is the paranormal romance with vampires. So I have to make sure I'm hitting that really, really hard and obvious with, red and black color scheme, fantasy serif fonts. But then if possible, I want to skew more towards the fantasy side of things, which is a little hard to do with a history of cover design. We used to have to get stock photos and then Photoshop them together. So it was really difficult to make realistic fantasy armor unless you had it custom illustrated. Custom illustration is really expensive, and I don't usually recommend it for indie authors because it's a big investment and it won't necessarily sell more books than a photo manipulated cover. Most of these are photo manipulated covers where they'd buy a stock photo and they'd add a face, change the hair, add some lights and fonts. You can make a pretty good cover without really being a designer just by buying digital assets. But good designers will blend it together better. It'll look more professional and they'll choose better fonts. Also, when you're researching covers this way, you can't really, like I couldn't send this to a designer and say, make me something like this, because it's too much. There's too much stuff going on. I'd have to pick a couple that I like and try to do something like that. Be really careful that you're never copying. You don't want to use the same fonts or colors or characters or faces. You can't, like, if people are all using stock photography. The argument with digital art, with AI art, is actually that you can't copyright your own cover, because all of that, even though I can use it commercially, I can't copyright it so that nobody else can use it. However, I'm making all of my AI art on a private server. Nobody else can see it or get access to it anyway. And I know that it's going to be unique because I generated it myself, whereas any other face or model could show up on another cover because it's not custom. So it is really difficult to choose from all of these. I like the really clean serif fonts on these. I love this cover with the red and the blue for something that's sort of similar in my genre, even though that one's not quite a vampire book. And then I also love this one by White Raven, which is actually also not really a vampire cover. They're just covers I really like that I think would fit the style of my book. But then I like the really clean serif fonts. And I also really like this one that's just urban fantasy, clean fonts, one character. The first book in the series actually came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and I've gone through many covers or idea covers. Some of these are not mine. Some of them were pre-made covers. But I've gone through many versions of something that kind of could work. This is another pre-made that I bought a year ago, maybe. That's very good. It's probably better than what I was using. And then these are the current covers that I have up on Amazon for this series, which are kind of fine. They kind of get some of the things right in terms of fantasy, but they're not really clear enough. Because I have vampire in the title, I don't have to make it obviously look vampire, but I'm just not getting the dangerous gothic vampire vibe. I've also been playing with AI art just to make a lot of character concepts. So some of these, like the vampire ones, I actually made like 100 of these, and now I'm determined to use them in a lot of my marketing and also in my A+ content. So this is really the vibe that I'm going for, but I don't really want to have these on my covers. I was tempted to use these, which are pretty cool for like a character card. I could put a review up at top. I could use this in my A+ content, and I might. But if I do use something like these, they don't quite match the style of my original. Not that it's a big deal, but I want my... It's really weird with Amazon right now, but with A+ content and adding your own images, I think it's going to become a little bit MySpace-y, where people can have really customized Amazon pages. So some other AI art that I really like the style of, even though they're not super clear on the details, are these. And also this one. Often, the more you spin your concepts, the worse the faces will get. So you might have to redo the face. You'll notice there's a little thing over here that looks like a signature, and people will claim that that means you're stealing from real artists, which is only partially true. It is true that AI trained on a lot of material that it didn't really have permission to train on, but it's also not illegal to be inspired by original work if I'm creating something new. So Midjourney creates something new, but what happens is if it looks at, 100,000 pieces of concept art, because there's not a lot of photos of, girls standing in the woods that look like this is definitely an illustrated style. So all of those 100,000 pieces of art will have some kind of signature, and it recognizes that to be like what I'm going for, it needs to create some kind of signature. So this is Midjourney adding details that it thinks belong on this kind of art. It's not, stealing from a particular artist. I know there are legal battles that are going to continue to, be discussed in the future, but just in the last few weeks, some very big companies have moved into AI digital art in a very significant way, which makes me think there's no way they're going to, you know, people have already said they're not going to put this back in the bottle, but that was a month or two ago. It's already too late for that. So the last time I was playing with this cover, I made something sort of like this, and I added in backgrounds that sort of related to each of the books in the series, and then these were character concept arts that I had made all in Midjourney. So I kind of very roughly photoshopped these together. These are not smooth or clean at all, but I was just trying to get a feel for what I could create. And then I asked my audience which they liked, and everybody preferred this one, which I basically agree that this one is probably coolest for the first book in the series. And then I did a little bit of work with it on Photoshop, and this is what I came up with. This is not what I'm finished. This is the starting point for today and all of the new AI art that I'm going to introduce. I've already probably figured out my typography. I'll show you real quick. Typography is text styles in Photoshop. So I've chosen a font, and then I have different layers, and each layer has a little bit different typographical effects. And then on top, there's just these glow lights, which I just painted on, red paint and screen with the blending mode to give it that extra bit of lighting. This is still pretty rough. I'll probably redo that or clean it up. Here are a couple of the other font choices that I had played with earlier. They're all kind of similar. I sort of knew what I had in mind. You don't want it to get too crazy with the distraction. And I'm already a busy designer where I add a lot more detail than necessary, and a very strong, simple cover can often be better than something that's too busy. So I may still end up going with something like this. I think it needs a little bit more work, but I'm just going to drag and drop in some new AI art that I just downloaded. So the main obvious problem is that I'm doing this in Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, how can you blend and edit all of this stuff together? I do have an online tool at DIYbookcovers.com, which is not quite finished, but should be up soon, which has blending layers so that you can do the things that I do in Photoshop. And it also has a bunch of free fonts that are pre-installed. But like I mentioned, in the near future, I don't really think you're going to need to blend or fix or edit at all. And also people will say that like Midjourney is a little bit messy, which I don't think will always be in the case in the future, but also I don't think it matters that much. Midjourney is very good at just creating one unified piece of art that looks like it belongs together. Even if the details are a little bit messed up, you could get someone to edit it for you. Or sometimes I think, the small details, I think right now it seems a little bit weird when the faces are all messed up, but I can... People don't look that closely at the details on the book cover, so they're never really going to zoom in and see that the face is unclear. So it's not as big of a deal as I think people make it out to be, and I don't think it's going to be a problem very long. Anyway, let me show you this folder. The other really cool thing about Midjourney is just that it can make so many variations. So I can keep spinning and get tons of things, and maybe one thing is not perfect, but the poses are close enough. I can mix 5 poses together and get different elements. You might also notice that, some of them, their clothes aren't quite fitting in the right place, or they're too revealing. It does some weird things sometimes, but I can just Photoshop that out. So there's 2 things I want to work on. One is something very similar to what I already have, but with a much cooler protagonist. And the other one is a potential symbolic cover like this. I never got exactly what I liked, and these aren't as clear or detailed as I need them to be. So that's probably going to be a problem for me, but I'm thinking about doing a hardcover edition with these really cool symbolic ones. And then also maybe the paperbacks will have the models. There's some more models down here. I got some better ones this time because Midjourney is always getting better. So I think I found some that will make a much bigger impact than my current model on the book cover. Also, I also got some really quick images. I probably would normally just buy stock photography to get a face that I could, fix if the AI, if it gets like the pose just right, the face is probably a little messed up. So I just generated some images that I can quickly swap out a face if I need to without needing to spend hours going through stock photo sites to find a face. So I've added my art into Photoshop. I'm going to leave the font that I've chosen. I'm already second guessing it a little bit because the cooler and more detailed the art is, the text, if it's too detailed or flourishy, it's going to detract from the artwork. So you want it all to work together. Also, this is imbalance between the character and the text, but I'm going to ignore it for now because it's really going to depend on, what art I end up using. So I'm not going to fuss around with the typography. I'm tempted to either make it cleaner and smaller or else bigger and bolder. But that's probably just because the spacing currently annoys me. Photoshop has a remove background feature that is pretty useful, so I can use an object selection tool and get any one of these characters. It's probably not going to do a perfect job. There are a lot of background removal tools. It actually does a pretty good job. Even it gets rid of this little weird thing up here that I don't want, but it misses a few things like the hilt of the sword, so I'd have to go in there and be a little bit careful. If you don't have Photoshop, there are a lot of background removal tools on the internet that work really well. So you could take any image like this and just strip out the background, and then you just copy and paste it and remove the other one, and then you have your character. So this other background, it looks kind of weird right now. There's this other lady back there, which I can try to really quickly just remove with a patch tool. It's not going to really work, but it'll be good enough maybe. All right, so something like that. Not perfect, but I like the background because it has a lot of texture. It has the moon. It has some really good trees and limbs and roots down here. So that's kind of like a default background for the kind of thing I'm trying to do. So then it would just be a matter of, where do I need her to stand so it looks natural. I'd want to balance out my text. You have to also choose whether you're going to put your text on the top or the bottom. I always used to prefer top. I always like to have text on the top, and it felt unbalanced to me to have it on the bottom. Maybe I've changed or softened for some reason, but I think in this case it just works better to have the text on the bottom half and then the character larger on the top half. So I know this is really messy because this is just kind of a dummy background for now, and I'd have to go back and clean everything up. Going back to my original cover, it would look something like this. So this was what I've already got, which looks fine. This would be a variation. I could almost just use this as a different series cover. She's a different size, but I actually like it that it's a little taller here. I think this character was a bit too small because I was trying to make space for all of that background. And it's still, kind of too busy and too detailed, but also pretty neat. I'd probably brighten the reds a bit, go up to adjustments, brightness, contrast, because I want that red to be really, really bold. And then I'd probably need to add a face because her hair's in her face. And there's this weird thing on her shoulder. Anyway, this dagger I'd have to get rid of. Some of the AI images that I got actually wouldn't really need even to cut out the background because it already added the smoky forest background. So real quick, I'll show you what those would look like, I think. So you can see basically that they work, but I would probably have to do a face swap and maybe fix the hair to touch it up a bit. But the nice part is just that there's so many different variations. The very cool thing is that this looks like photography, except for, there's a lot of details that would be hard to find in reality. So it looks like a Photoshop, but it looks like a very expensive Photoshop because you imagine someone had to dress up and wear the costume. It doesn't quite look illustrated, and it would be a lot of work to try to find something like this by putting together stock photography. And even like in the last 5 years, people have used stock 3D renders, which look really cool, but they don't really look realistic yet. And so that's also, they've been really common because everyone's using the same stock renders. So just something like this, I know is going to make my book stand out in a very unique way. But I could use all of this art, if I fixed the faces pretty much as is, because it's already got a believable background. It's not really as much as I'd like. I mean, the background's kind of vague. I'd have to get rid of some of these extra little weird details. But I'm just showing you because they kind of, they're almost good enough to use. They're certainly good enough to use by blending them together and recreating the cover that I had before in a little more detail. I think all of these need to be, darkened. I've got a layer that darkens the edges, but I'm not sure where it is. Then I also got a lot of characters like this, which just had a gradient background. Sometimes when it gets too much detail, it just kind of cops out and doesn't finish. So these ones I would definitely have to remove the background, which is really easy to do in Photoshop or with some online background removing tools. You used to be able to pay someone on Fiverr to remove backgrounds for you in bulk, but with the online tools now, it's really not necessary. I had to get those little extra details that it missed. I went back into Midjourney because I needed something, so just in case I haven't explained it already, Midjourney allows you to put in a text prompt and it will generate graphic images for you. So I just wanted to show you the diversity with all of the different kinds of art that I don't even think I can use, but I've made thousands and thousands of images in the last couple of months, which are very good. Some of these I can use for character art or for promotion or ads or something, even if I can't really use them on a book cover. Some of them are really neat, like a geometric style. I'll probably like make a blog post for vampire art and just find a place to put them all up, maybe on Pinterest or something. I think they'll drive traffic. These worked really well too, but a little bit too much for like a kid's book. I could also make really good graphic stuff. I had problems changing the resolution, so I loved these designs, but I needed them taller, and I haven't found a way to go back and change the resolution on the same image prompt. There probably is a way to do that. Maybe I'll revisit it because I'd love to do these on like full page interior book layout design. But I was specifically looking for an illustrated vampire castle that I can put behind some of the images that look a little more illustrated. Something like this would be a really cool symbol cover. I could just use it as it is almost. I could also see these being like chapter headers. I made a whole series of just chapter header graphics for interior formatting, and those look really good as well. And then for backgrounds, these were a bunch of really quick haunted house Halloween ones that I actually made for another series, the Scarlet Thread series, which is a little bit more dark fantasy. So I have all these other images for that series. There's some really neat different types of styles, background fantasy art that I kind of want to use for something. This I love. I might use that for a book cover. This is more epic fantasy. So I went back and stripped out the background for some of these different models so that you can see how they might look. I haven't done significant photoshopping on them yet. I just kind of wanted to show the variety. People also say it's difficult to get series covers with AI art. I think you can already see that I got a lot of different poses to use, but I think in the future it's going to get much easier to respin content and get different poses. So this is kind of the original one that jumped out at me that I like a lot. I might end up using something like this. I'm not sure about the background yet, but let me quickly just show you the different variations of poses. And these are all straight, from Midjourney. So some of the details aren't quite there. I might have to redo or replace. Definitely have to fix the faces. But the armor, the body, this is pretty on genre for what I'm looking for. And I have enough different variety that I could, create a whole series. I kind of like the one in white. I'm not sure if that really goes with the vampire style, but I think she wears something like that in the final scene, so it would make some sense. Some of them had their heads cut off, like towards the top, so I would have to, find a different head that kind of fit and Photoshop it together. This one's pretty neat too. That might make a good first book in the series. I had some other ones I did earlier with a lot more weapons and armor, but more of an illustrated look. That one's pretty neat too. More illustrated though. So the problem is if it's too illustrated, the background, if it's photographic, it won't really blend in well together. The other thing I would point out is that I like the background, the greenish blue dark background contrasts better with the red, but it's a little bit, it's those Christmassy colors that like green and red are the best contrast, but it's hard to escape the Christmas association, and it doesn't really hit the vampire theme as hard because of the bluish background. You can also see that like in the original photo, she stands out a lot better because the background is a lot lighter, so all the weapons and stuff stands out. Some of that we can fix. A lot of this is just blended layers. So I have a little bit of a color wash that's set over the background. So I can just remove that and then I get the black and white, which is actually a lot stronger for vampire. So I'll probably stick with something like this. I could also go something like this, just a little crazy with the red, but I'm probably not going to do that. Or the other advantage is if I do want to add the blue, then with layers you can add another of those color washes on top of the character so that she blends in a little more to the scene. And I've also got this other one. It's just kind of a layer that I'm blending to get some of the softer effects and the floating debris. So if in Photoshop you can blend layers, that's how you get the depth for a really high quality cover. You can't do that with online tools like Canva. I do have an online tool at DIYcovers.com that allows you to blend layers. It's still not quite ready, but I think when it works, it'll look a lot like this and you'll be able to blend layers together. It'll be the only online tool that allows you to do that, which is pretty exciting, especially now that people can make their own art with AI. All they really need is a way to lay out the text and blend layers together. I did have some other art from earlier that was more illustrated, which I like a lot, but then I would need more of an illustrated style background, and mine is kind of photoshopped together. So, and also like I mentioned, I don't think illustrated covers are necessarily stronger, although some of these, like this is really great art. It's a lot stronger and bolder. I'm not saying, you know, don't use it. If you do get a chance to use something that's a little bit more illustrated, you just need a background to match. I actually like this almost better than some of my other options, so I might have to think on that. This was another one I don't think I showed you that didn't have a head, so I'd have to kind of use one of the poses and then try to Photoshop them together a little bit so she has a head. These are also some of the older ones that I thought worked pretty well, but they're a little bit too revealing for young adult, and I think even though it's paranormal romance, it's not reverse harem, I want to go a little bit more towards the young adult epic fantasy side with the armor. And then there was some stuff like this that's a fantasy illustrated style dress. Not the face, I would need something different for that. But fitting together different pieces that I had got in the last round, I still like quite a bit, so I'm not sure whether I'll use the new round or the older round, maybe on one of the series. So let's assume we're going to use something like this. I can just add in a face from stock photo. This isn't exactly the right angle. It's not quite right, but it's also not bad for an AI generated image. And then I would fix the hair. So I've got a whole folder full of hair, which sounds creepy, but looks kind of like this. It's a bunch of brushes or assets or pictures that I can use. Sometimes if you get a really good one, you could just kind of drag and drop it in there, blend, and then you'd have to blend the layer mode to multiply to show up the dark parts. I'm having trouble dragging and dropping. This is already a long video and I'm worried. Plus this huge Photoshop file that my computer might crash before I finish. So I'm gonna skip the hair. You can kind of see what it looks like. I would have some hair, you know, looking more realistic and blowing out a little bit. And then we also need to fix the lighting. The eye will be drawn towards the most, the space with the most lighting. So you want to be careful to make her face a little bit lighter so the eye is drawn to the face and the text, I'd probably make the whole background a little bit darker, and then I can also get her to stand out. You can see I've got a little bit of a gradient layer here that just shifts the lighting towards the top. And then I have some layers like this that would do it even a little bit more. If I put that in front of the character, it'd get more lighting on her face. Which looks like that. Might be a little bit too much. But then also there's not enough contrast between the background and her. So I'd kind of want like just that lighting around her face and not the rest of it. Anyway, so not perfect, but now I have this tiny little square of layer, so I can change the opacity just to make her face brighter. And then I kind of wanted to darken all of the background as well. So I can just take a black color wash, change the blending maybe to overlay, and then change the opacity, which gives it like a much darker gothic feel, but also loses a lot of the detail. So I kind of like how it's really black and red now, which is a lot more attractive for the vampire genre, but still I think I'll make it not quite that dark. Then we need to add some more lighting around the character. The problem with just copy pasting a character onto a background is that the lighting doesn't quite look natural. You need some light behind her and some light in front of her. That's what makes that really dramatic, realistic kind of cover. So here's the layer. I could just go up here to layer style and add an outer glow. So I could do something like that. The outer glow stands out a little bit too much. It doesn't look realistic. Also, it goes to the full character down here, which doesn't work. It only works up here on the top. So you could like divide this into two different pieces and try to do it that way. I'm actually going to delete that outer glow and I'm going to paint it on manually. So I'm just going to add a new layer and grab my paintbrush. And I want some lighter, larger pieces behind my protagonist. But I'm going to set the opacity lower so it's not too strong. Oops, I have the wrong color. So now this is just kind of a big circle of white that I can change the blending mode, probably to overlay would make it really dramatic. Soft light is almost not enough. Just kind of a little bit of lighting. I could also just duplicate that layer if I wanted a little bit more. And then there's like a line up here I've got to edit out. The online design tool at DIY Covers has an eraser tool. It's a little bit buggy, but you kind of can erase around the edges of layers. It's not really great for like cutting out the background. I'm not actually sure I even love this glow because it kind of takes away from that really dramatic black and white scene. So I'd want to be a little bit cautious with how much I'm using. Also, I'm going to put some more in front. And that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. Right now, you can see the other character back there behind her is filling in some of that space. So that's a problem, but it wouldn't be if I didn't have multiple layers. So this time I'm going to go in a little bit softer with a smaller brush and try to get the contours just a little bit, like assuming some light is coming from the sides. it's kind of difficult to figure out where they should be and make it look natural. So now if this is on top and I blend it, and I might even add one more layer. Then with an eraser, you could come back and clean it up a little bit. So you want the light to kind of just be a little bit coming around the character to make it look like she's more in the scene. So this might be too much light altogether, but that's kind of how you get that effect where it looks like it's that glowy, magical 3D effect. It's with different layers of blended white, or you could do black for shadows, but generally it's white like this. Or if it was a urban fantasy, maybe it's a pink light or a blue light, depending on the ambiance of the scene. You also have to be aware of where the light's coming from. So this is kind of weird. It draws the eye to the waist, and there's not really a light source behind her. I should have a big full moon maybe. I mean, since the sky is so dark now, I could actually replace all of this dark stuff instead of with a cloudy sky. I could give it a moon or a starry sky, which would look awesome, but in my book, there's the clouds are all, the sky is cloudy and stormy. They never see the moon, so I can't do that in my particular case, even though it would look really cool. But if I kept it darker even and just added like, you know, just a little bit of lighting to give it that effect, it would look cooler if the other character back there wasn't in the way also. All right, so the almost final thing, I'll also mention down here, just it's a little thing, but the drop shadow is too heavy behind the author name, so it makes it stand out a little too much. You want the drop shadow to be there, but not obvious. So I would kind of just cut this in about half. So it still stands out, it just looks cleaner not to have a heavy drop shadow like that. I have some decorations up here in the corners, left over from my first version of the cover. And they kind of work, but I also threw in a bunch of, you know, other stuff. So now it just looks kind of scratchy and messy. I'm kind of okay with it, but I was also playing with some other very bold corner illustrations that I also got from AI art, which looked something like this. So this was just, you know, like a symbolic. I think these were the chapter headings I was talking about earlier that I was going to use for chapter headings because they look really cool, even though I don't have a high resolution version. So I kind of wanted to go like, I told you I'm too busy as a designer. So if you have something, I thought something very sharp and symbolic like this could look very cool. It doesn't quite work with the background. It's a little bit more realistic, but I still kind of like it. You know, if I put it somewhere like that. I don't hate it if it was cleaner. It's just, you know, too much. But I was playing with putting some of that in the corners. Anyway, is it too much? Sure. You want to see how it looks as a thumbnail. So the problem is if it gets too busy and too complicated, it's almost nonsensical. On the other hand, really bold, symbolic, high contrast like that stands out a little bit better. It doesn't all mesh together. It gets too messy and too complicated. The problem is the more messy it is, the harder it is to pull it off and make it look good. Also, I mentioned the eye is drawn to the lightest portions, so there's a balance to where the eye is drawn. Without these lights, the lights actually confuse it a bit because previously I think the eye would be drawn to the face, which is great, and then to the text, which is kind of how you want it to go. You want the eye drawn to the central thematic object or character or protagonist of your story, and then to the fonts and the typography of your title, probably. So when I add stuff like this, then it's cool, but it's kind of overwhelming. The eye doesn't really find a place to settle. It's just kind of, I don't know, overcome. It does. There's a power in just getting attention when your book cover is fighting for attention as a thumbnail on Amazon. So, having more to stand out is not the worst thing, even if it looks a little unprofessional. And I'm kind of going for that. Like, I want it to look cooler and stand out more than any other book in my category, which is obviously very, very hard to do. Okay, so before I wrap this up, I'm going to play around with some of this other art that I also found, which is very cool and doesn't really need anything to be done with it. That last video, this video actually, I wanted to be like a really quick thing. I was just going to show you how I could drag and drop art into Photoshop and make it work. It's not quite there yet, but I think it will be pretty soon. But some of this stuff is already amazing, almost amazing, and I don't really need to do very much. All right, so I started with just adding one background that's all AI generated, just to compare like one that I made myself in Photoshop by blending all the layers together. The value of something like Midjourney is that the whole piece just looks like one piece of concept art. It's a little bit smoother and cleaner. So this is obviously something very, very different. This is one piece of AI art. All I did was replace the face. This is the original face, which is just a mess. I used the same face from earlier, and it doesn't really blend with normal. So if you go to luminosity, it kind of matches the colors of the background. It looks like one piece of art, and that basically works. I don't think it's quite clean or clear enough. I don't think it's high resolution enough to use as a book cover. And I would take away these corner things because they don't go with this particular art. I could use some of my lighting effects like this one to make the lighting up on the top half. So this is more like a symbolic or typographic cover. Since it's more like 2D, a little bit more flat, I'd probably take away the lighting effects on the font, maybe even the bevel, and just leave it flat and simple. These lighting effects, they go with the depth of a 3D cover, but they don't really fit with a typographic cover like this. But there are a lot of elements I really like in these, so I might use them for something. I want to show you just the amount of variety I've got. Also, since there's a lot of these that have elements on the top and the bottom, I'm going to move the font up here in the middle. The balance is still kind of weird. And like I mentioned, these are not high resolution. And the problem with spinning things, like to get insane detail and complexity in the background, it loses some of the detail every time. It gets more detailed, but it gets more messy. So a lot of these, like, I would have to kind of redo a lot of the elements. And I don't think they're quite sharp or clear enough to use, but I still like them a lot because all I did was tell the machines what elements I wanted, and then I kept respinning it until I got some really cool stuff. So I'm just going to go through the layers really quickly so you can see some of the stuff that I did. If this was high resolution, if it was really clean, these could be really strong colors. The ones that are pink are great, but if I wanted to make them red, that would be pretty easy to do, or purple or whatever. I like that, I really like the ones that have like a hole and the silhouette around the girl with the dress, and then this huge castle with the light up here. There's a lot of cool things going on in here where it's kind of 2D, but it's also, there's got lighting to it. Again, with the flat cover, I'd probably take the drop shadow off of this text because it doesn't really match the flat art of the background. So you can see the same thing without the drop shadow actually looks a lot cleaner. It fits in better with the design. A lot of these also kind of had like floral. They look kind of like roses or flowers, or a lot of them look like blood vessels of a heart, which is really neat. It's very complex. And so there's kind of a halo up here. I'd have to replace this super messy lady with an actual girl in a red dress, but I've got a lot of other options for that. And then some of them are almost clean enough, like with the, if it was high resolution, if I replace the face up here. And then some of them had a really neat, like the blood vessel thorns, and then it goes into kind of a bloody stain on a white dress. There are also some like this that just had a character and a background, but it's all one piece of art. Again, these aren't high resolution. I must have saved it the wrong way, or I got the sizing wrong. And even if they were high resolution, I don't think the detail is quite there. They're a little bit messy. I could try to just sharpen it a lot, but it just looks a little bit like it's weird because it's a 2D object cover, but parts of it look a little bit too messy and illustrated. Still, I might be able to make something of it if I worked hard enough. Just so you can see it, I positioned the text and added the face to this one as an example of like it's rough and messy, but it doesn't really matter once you put the face on there. That's high definition. I even kind of like these red gradient stripes on the sides with a little bit of decoration. This would be a passably good cover if I could get a high resolution and clean it up a little bit. Same thing with some of these other ones. A lot of these just have too many artifacts and they're a bit too messy, I think, to be used, which is why I probably won't use them. I just like them a lot. They make great character art or for promotion or something, but I don't think they're quite detailed enough to use on the cover, which is why I'll probably use the ones I showed you earlier that are a little more photorealistic. That's just the style I like. However, if I got one of these just right, it would really stand out as a brandable series. I like these ones that have the white castle with all this blood vessel. If I mix a bunch of these together, I'll show you what I mean later, but there's a white castle on top, there's a girl with a dress down at the bottom, and then a bunch of like heart floral stuff. If it was really clean and clear and crazy detailed, that would be something I'd kind of like to use because they really do stand out. And they look like really professional art that costs a lot of money. Or they would if they were just a little bit cleaner. And like I said, I think, right now, Midjourney is very good, but in a few months, it's going to be twice what it is now. So these I really like with the thorns and the flowers, the girl with the bloody dress up on top. So I thought for the series, maybe, one white tower on top, one girl in the dress on top, and then something else. I've got 4 books though, so it gets a little bit tricky. This one's also got some great texture. If I tried, I could sharpen a little bit and then change the brightness contrast. Just to make it a little bit darker. I really like this one too. It's simpler, it's more conceptual, but it just looks a lot cleaner, especially the way the text interacts with these other little elements. So if I replace this girl on top with a realistic photo of a ball gown and a realistic face, it could be a really cool cover. This is similar to the one I showed you earlier. It's actually got some other little details. The nice thing, like if I kept respinning this, it might get more and more details around this edge, this frame, but I do like this frame a little bit better, so I could replace this face and move the text down again, but I'm not going to do that right now because I've got a bunch of others to show you. This is a pretty great one also, almost as is. It's not quite detailed enough, but it's pretty close. The nice thing, a lot of people are talking about how AI art will help empower artists. So for example, now that I know what this looks like, I could come back and replace some elements and basically recreate it all in Photoshop with different elements and make it all cleaner. I could do that, but that's a lot of work. And I think if I just kept respinning this, or if I wait a month until Midjourney is better, I could get a very realistic version of this that's pretty clean and ready to be used, basically. These are the ones I really liked the most, but I just don't think they're, for some reason, I don't think they're detailed, or they look a little bit like they're hand sketched or illustrated, and I wanted them to be a little more realistic. I tried to make this one a little bit more more red, but I actually sort of like the pink and purple, even if it's not quite as vampire. This works really well. Also, it's got a little shelf down here. There's some other ones that have kind of like a little door at the bottom that has a, it means I could replace the central character with anything. I could replace this little character, 4 times just to make my series. That would be pretty easy to do. This is another neat scene where it's got a big castle and it even has some really detailed fangs coming down here on the side. And then down here in the forest, there's a girl with a light, but I could replace this with any kind of a character and use different detail in each cover. I'm not really sure what it was trying to do down here with this one. If I did do, some of these have a lot of detail at the very bottom. So I would just do something kind of like that to make sure I don't cover up any elements. And I could actually, like, just for example, I could put any of my characters down there. It doesn't really fit in with the flat background. It's a different kind of style. But it kind of works. I might sort of be able to make it work. Generally with book covers, the larger the character, the more it's character driven or plot heavy, and the smaller the character, the more it's world building and epic scenery. So something like this has a very tiny protagonist going on a really large quest against this entire kingdom. That sends the right message. And I think a style like this will attract more traditionally readers who like to buy traditionally published books because it looks a little more like a traditionally published illustrated book cover. However, I don't think it would perform as well on Amazon because when you just look at the thumbnails, there's so much detail that it doesn't really show up as a thumbnail. It's not going to have that same striking immediate effect that my other covers with the larger cover model would have. This one's pretty neat too. Like I mentioned, if I replace this little doorway so that it's just kind of a black background, then I could fill this space with any detailed character. I could, shrink somebody down and put them in that space. I could even make this doorway a lot larger to take up, more space and then have a larger character. This one's pretty neat too, but I think I showed you something similar earlier. And then this one doesn't really have any scene. It's got 2 castles, which isn't a big deal. It looks kind of interesting, but feels like it's missing something, which is probably the girl in the dress or the main protagonist. But this would make a really nice background, even if I did something kind of like this with a much larger figure and then I move the text down. This would have been nice if it was more detailed. It looks like it could have like some really nice detail with the dress going into the flowers down here. It just didn't quite turn out. Here's a few more that were just, the full image thing. So with the face, it would look kind of like that. And it actually has some really neat stuff coming in here on the side. So the problem, of course, with using AI or something like this is that you have so many options. It's hard enough to choose from 1 or 2 good options. And none of these are quite perfect, so I'd have to do some work on them. Although, like I mentioned, some of them are pretty close to being something very special. The one I was really trying to get to work Some of them, I have kind of these werewolves in my book. So some of these have a castle and then a big werewolf head in the middle. So if I could kind of combine them all together, where I had the girl in the dress either on top and then the werewolf and the palace at the bottom, or if I had some of those with the palace on top up here and the girl down here and then the werewolf head in the middle. The problem is where you would find room for the text, because like the whole that concept is perfect if I got it really smooth with, you know, the girl and the slagpaw, the werewolf trying to get up into the vampire palace. It's conceptual, it represents everything in the book, it's very unique and specific, but it also just, like, it's very brandable. Even just switching between these two, you can see these symbolic characters, they stand out. I think a lot of people would like them better. Also, they're cleaner and they're simpler, so they just kind of like, they look interesting, they look cool. They're just cleaner covers. But this is more what they're used to. This is kind of what they're looking for. I don't know, it'd be hard to tell. The other thing I've done is I just started advertising book one again. So once I clean some of these up and I decide on, probably I would have a symbolic cover series and a characters cover series. And then I would have versions of those and I would test them out. Most people don't test their book covers, but it can make a really big difference in your advertising conversion. So it's kind of worth like running ads for a week with one cover. I would especially do this like when you publish book one, do a lot of testing on book one to make sure you're making smart decisions before you invest in the rest of the series. But I really like the way that this looks, and I'm going to be tempted to try that out as opposed to these, which I also like a lot. They're very different. So I'll probably try to make versions of both. I already had like several different series covers made. I think I showed you earlier, but this is the new direction based on the new art that I found. Now I have kind of two pretty significantly different options. I have plenty of art to make a series once I make some decisions about placement and everything. But I do like the style of these. I think these are a little bit too fantasy. They're not quite as vampire, but they do, you know, look really good if I can get clean versions of them. Anyway, that's all I've really got to cover. I wanted to just show you all of the art, and I probably talked too much like usual, but this is a really kind of, it's an exciting and scary time because this is brand new. It's improving very, very quickly. It's going to replace where you get stock photography from. It makes it a lot easier to get illustrated styles, or like concept art like this would have been impossible to get without spending a lot of money. And now you can get it for, you know, $30 is what I'm paying for Midjourney. The pricing is going to change. A lot of big companies are going to step in a big way. So there's going to be some new tools for cover design that didn't exist before. And a lot of them are going to be based on image prompts. So instead of searching for existing images, you will be typing in what you want and it will create custom images for you. I know people are upset and it's very controversial, but this is, we've had discussions about this and it's hard to really talk about it without showing you the results, showing you, you know, what you can get from AI art compared to what you could do if you hired somebody to do it for you. Because even something like this, if I hired a cover designer, they couldn't make a character like this unless they hand drew it from scratch. Most cover designers aren't that good at illustration. They might be pretty good, but they're probably not good enough to do a realistic character art. And they certainly couldn't do an almost photorealistic alternative like the other options that I have that look like they could be photographs. So I actually suspect, like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of new cover design tools that incorporate typography and AI generation of text from prompts, from AI generation of images from text prompts. I think that's going to be coming in another year or so. It's going to really shift a lot of the way that cover design in general, but also graphic design in general to a huge degree. All of the images or memes that are being made and shared on social media, there's going to be a lot of new business models sprouting up around this technology. It's getting better very quickly. I suspect in another year or so, you may even be able to do something like type in the title, like what you want, and the typography, and it'll just make a finished cover for you. Or there'll be some tools that allow you to add text. Right now, there aren't very many that allow you to do the things that you can do in Photoshop in terms of using fonts that are appropriate for the genre, because Canva and most of the other online tools just have some kind of default dummy fonts that aren't really good enough for high quality genre cover design. And you won't be able to blend layers together. So maybe you can, remove the background and slap a character onto a background, like an AI character onto an AI background, but you won't be able to blend it together and get the depth and the lighting and everything like that without Photoshop. I do have a tool that I've mentioned on DIYcovers.com, which I hope will be available soon. I think it's only like, until AI is good enough to replace even that tool. I've been building that tool for like 5 years, and it's a very good idea to have a tool like that, but it's very difficult to make a tool like that because Photoshop is a billion-dollar investment company. It's obviously a very good tool. Mine's a low-budget tool that kind of does the same thing, but it's free and online. But I do think it's going to be really useful when you just want to add some text or make some promo graphics or things like that. So since I'm talking about it so much, I have other videos on this tool, but you can choose specific sizes for promotion, depending on what you need. And then there's layers, and you can blend the layers together just like Photoshop. You can add text, and there's a bunch of fonts. I think it's gonna be a really neat tool. I won't go into more detail right now, but that will be available on DIYbookcovers.com. I'd love to hear some feedback. I know I showed you a mountain of covers, and it's hard to remember, but just between, which covers you like more, symbolic or the character concept art, let me know if you have a preference between all of these. I am making some decisions, and I probably am gonna try to update my series pretty soon when I launch book 4. But if you have any questions about book cover design, I have tons of resources on book cover design, as well as book cover design templates to try to help indie authors to publish on a budget without having really ugly covers. I think this is a big deal. I think AI art is a really big deal. And I'm excited about the new tools that are going to come out.